sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles in the 1970s was a city of contrasts. Glittering Hollywood dreams juxtaposed with stark realities. Within this vast urban landscape lay an area largely unseen, often deliberately overlooked by the wider populace. This was Skid Row, a concentrated expanse of vulnerability and desperation. It was here, amidst the forgotten corners and shadowed alleyways, that a predator began to stalk. This was not a killer who sought out the prominent or the powerful. His targets were, by grim design, the most vulnerable members of society, those whose existence often went unacknowledged. The scene was set, not for a grand drama, but for a chilling narrative of terror. No one anticipated the monster who would emerge from the shadows of this neglected district. His name would eventually become synonymous with brutal, unfeeling violence. Vaughn Greenwood. His reign of terror would not be a fleeting moment but a prolonged horror, spanning over a decade, leaving an indelible mark of fear and confusion upon the city. He moved through this landscape of the marginalized, a silent threat, his presence initially undetected, his intentions unfathomable. The city, unknowingly, became the hunting ground for an individual who defied conventional understanding of criminal behavior, a killer whose actions would eventually expose a stark truth about societal neglect. Vaughn Greenwood was not the archetype of a serial killer often portrayed in popular imagination. He did not possess a disheveled appearance or exhibit overt signs of instability. On the contrary, Greenwood was remarkably intelligent and notably well-spoken. His demeanor was calm, even articulate, defying any conventional expectation of a criminal. He was the kind of individual who could blend effortlessly into any crowd, engaging in polite conversation, leaving no memorable impression that would flag him as dangerous. This ordinary exterior was perhaps his most terrifying weapon, allowing him to operate unseen, a ghost in plain sight. Beneath this veneer of normalcy, however, resided a profound and deeply ingrained hatred. This animosity was directed specifically towards the homeless population. For Greenwood, the individuals living on the streets were not simply victims. They were targets chosen precisely because of their invisibility to society. He understood, with chilling clarity, that these individuals were often ignored, their disappearances or deaths unlikely to provoke widespread alarm or intense investigation. This societal neglect became his perverse shield, providing the perfect cover for his unspeakable acts. His chilling methodology earned him a grim moniker, the Skid Row Slasher. This title accurately reflected the brutal nature of his attacks. His signature method involved the savage slashing of throats, often from ear to ear, ensuring a swift and agonizing end for his victims. Yet, the violence did not conclude with the death itself. Many of his crime scenes exhibited highly peculiar and unsettling elements. Bodies were frequently found in ritualistic poses, arranged in ways that suggested a deliberate, symbolic intent rather than a random act of violence. Furthermore, there was a disturbing pattern of spreading blood across the victims, not in a chaotic manner, but in what appeared to be occult symbolism. This added a layer of bizarre, almost ceremonial, horror to each murder, elevating his crimes beyond mere killing into something far more ritualistic and deeply disturbing. The combination of his ordinary appearance and extraordinary cruelty made him a truly unique and terrifying figure in the city's grim criminal history. The chronological unfolding of Vaughn Greenwood's killing spree presents a particularly unsettling pattern, revealing not a continuous rampage but a chilling hiatus that initially misled investigators. His horrific journey into serial murder began far earlier than many realized, casting a long, dark shadow over the city. The initial tremors of his violence were felt in 1964. In that year, 2 brutal murders occurred, bearing the distinctive hallmarks that would later become synonymous with the Skid Row Slasher. The victims met their end through the same savage method of throat slashing, and the crime scenes bore unsettling resemblances to what would follow. These were not random, isolated acts. They were the genesis of a macabre methodology. However, after these 2 initial atrocities, Greenwood inexplicably vanished. His murderous activity ceased abruptly, leaving no further trace. This prolonged period of dormancy led police to a grave miscalculation. Lacking additional incidents, they concluded that these 2 brutal killings were likely a one-off event, perhaps the work of an individual who had either died, been incarcerated for other crimes, or simply ceased their violent tendencies. The trail went cold, and the fear subsided, though the two unsolved murders remained as grim, isolated entries in the city's crime records. Then, a decade later, the chilling pattern reemerged with terrifying intensity. From 1974 to 1975, Vaughn Greenwood returned to his hunting ground, unleashing a renewed spree of violence that was far more prolific and even more horrifying than his initial acts. This second wave saw the murder count rise dramatically, with 9 more victims falling prey to his savage attacks. Each subsequent murder seemed to escalate in its depravity and its adherence to the bizarre ritualistic elements that defined his methodology. The brief period of this resurgence, just over a year, was marked by an astonishing rate of killings, indicating a chillingly efficient and determined predator. The majority of his victims during this intense period were homeless men, underscoring his deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable. These individuals, already living on the fringes of society, often lacked strong connections or networks, making their disappearances or deaths less likely to be immediately noticed or extensively investigated. This unfortunate reality provided Greenwood with a perverse sense of security, allowing him to operate with a chilling degree of impunity within the neglected urban landscape. The scenes where the bodies were discovered during this 1974 to 1975 spree were deeply disturbing, far exceeding the brutality of typical homicides. Many victims were found surrounded by what appeared to be ritualistic elements. Police discovered cups of blood carefully placed near the bodies, not haphazardly spilled, but arranged with a chilling intent. Candles were sometimes found, either lit or recently extinguished, suggesting a deliberate staging of the scene, perhaps even a macabre ceremony conducted at the very moment of death or immediately afterward. Furthermore, bodies were often placed in highly specific symbolic arrangements, indicating a carefully choreographed presentation. These elements went far beyond the act of murder itself, pointing to a twisted spiritual or occult motivation behind Greenwood's actions. The pervasive signature of his violence remained consistent. Victims invariably had their throats slit from ear to ear, a gruesome hallmark that left no doubt as to the identity of the perpetrator once the cases were finally linked. This deliberate and consistent method, combined with the bizarre ritualistic aspects, solidified his terrifying reputation and provided critical clues for the investigators who would eventually pursue him. The city was gripped by a growing fear, as the true nature of the predator lurking in its forgotten corners began to reveal itself. As the number of victims mounted during the 1974 to 1975 spree, a profound sense of dread began to settle over Los Angeles, particularly in the vicinity of Skid Row. The repeated discoveries of bodies, each bearing the same gruesome hallmarks, could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. The methodical brutality and chilling ritualistic elements pointed to a single, terrifying perpetrator. It was during this period that the media, attempting to capture the public's growing fear and the elusive nature of the killer, bestowed upon him the infamous title, the Skid Row Slasher. This moniker became a shorthand for the unseen horror haunting the city's forgotten streets, amplifying public awareness and pressuring law enforcement to intensify their efforts. The police investigation, initially fragmented by the seemingly disparate cases, began to coalesce as patterns emerged. Detectives, working diligently, started to link the murders through a series of signature crime scene details. The consistency of the method, the ear-to-ear throat slashing, was a primary indicator. But it was the more unusual elements that truly connected the cases. The specific positioning of bodies, the presence of cups of blood, the strategic placement of candles, and the unsettling symbolic arrangements around the victims. These were not random acts of a frenzied killer, but deliberate components of a macabre ritual. Forensic teams meticulously documented every detail, gathering trace evidence that, in time, would prove crucial. The task was daunting, given the transient nature of the victims and the challenging environment of Skid Row, where witnesses were scarce and often reluctant to come forward. Yet, the persistent patterns provided the threads that detectives desperately needed to begin weaving a coherent picture of their elusive suspect. The breakthrough in the investigation, though agonizingly slow to arrive, finally occurred in 1975. After months of intense scrutiny and mounting frustration, law enforcement received a critical piece of information. A witness, whose identity and circumstances remain largely shielded from public knowledge, reported spotting an individual near a recent murder scene who matched a description that had circulated among the few who observed strange activities in the area. This was not a definitive identification, but it provided a much-needed lead, a tangible person of interest in a case dominated by shadows. Police acted on this information with urgency, tracing the individual's movements and gathering intelligence. What followed was a meticulously executed process of comparison and corroboration. Once a suspect, later identified as Vaughn Greenwood, was brought in for questioning, the real forensic work began to connect the dots. Crucially, fingerprints obtained from one of the murder sites were meticulously compared against those of Greenwood. The results were irrefutable. A definitive match was established. This forensic link provided the concrete evidence that investigators had desperately sought for over a decade. It was the scientific proof that definitively tied Vaughn Greenwood to the gruesome tableau of the Skid Row slasher murders. Confronted with the overwhelming forensic evidence, Vaughn Greenwood eventually confessed. He admitted to the 1970s murders, detailing his actions during that intense spree. However, in a chilling act of denial or perhaps a warped sense of control, he adamantly denied any involvement in the original 1964 killings. This contradiction posed an immediate challenge for investigators. Yet, despite his verbal denial, the forensic evidence spoke a louder, more irrefutable truth. The same distinct patterns of violence, the identical methods of murder, and crucially, additional forensic clues, including latent prints and other trace evidence, definitively linked him to both the 1964 victims and the 1974-75 spree. His attempt to compartmentalize his crimes failed, as the scientific facts bridged the decade-long gap, confirming that the silent predator of Skid Row had been operating for far longer than initially understood. His arrest marked the end of a terrifying chapter for Los Angeles, bringing a semblance of closure to a city haunted by an unseen killer. The arrest of Vaughn Greenwood brought a palpable, though uneasy, sense of relief to Los Angeles. The Skid Row slasher, a specter that had haunted the city's underbelly for years, was finally apprehended. What followed was the painstaking legal process designed to bring justice to his victims and accountability to their killer. The trial of Vaughn Greenwood was a stark and somber affair, revealing the meticulous dedication of law enforcement and the grim realities of his crimes. Greenwood was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of murder. These convictions directly corresponded to the victims from his intense 1974 to 1975 spree, the murders to which he had partially confessed and for which the forensic evidence was overwhelmingly abundant. However, the true scale of his depravity was believed to extend further. Investigators strongly suspected him in at least 11 murders, including the 2 initial killings from 1964. While the direct conviction count stood at 9, the overwhelming circumstantial and forensic links to the earlier victims solidified the police's belief that his reign of terror encompassed a wider, more prolonged period. This disparity between the number of convictions and the suspected victim count is not uncommon in complex serial killer cases, often due to challenges in evidence collection over time or the difficulty of securing convictions for older, cold cases. Nevertheless, the 9 convictions represented a decisive victory for justice and ensured that Greenwood would be removed from society permanently. The sentence handed down to Vaughn Greenwood was a life sentence. This punishment effectively ensured that he would spend the remainder of his days incarcerated, preventing him from ever again posing a threat to the public. He was not eligible for parole, signifying the severity with which his crimes were viewed by the justice system. The sentencing definitively marked him as one of the most violent and bizarre serial killers in Los Angeles' history. His methodology, combining extreme brutality with perplexing ritualistic elements, set him apart from many other notorious figures. His systematic targeting of the marginalized, his decade-long evasion, and the unsettling nature of his crime scenes cemented his dark legacy in the annals of Californian crime. Perhaps the most profoundly unsettling aspect of Vaughn Greenwood's public appearance, particularly during his trial, was his calm demeanor. Throughout the proceedings, as the gruesome details of his crimes were laid bare for the court, Greenwood displayed an astonishing lack of emotion. There was no visible remorse, no outward sign of regret, sorrow, or even agitation. He maintained a composed, almost detached presence, observing the proceedings as if he were an impartial spectator rather than the accused perpetrator of heinous acts. This chilling serenity in the face of overwhelming evidence and the immense suffering he caused profoundly shocked those who witnessed it. It spoke to a deep-seated pathology, a profound void of empathy that allowed him to commit such atrocities without apparent internal conflict. His quietness was not one of submission, but rather a perplexing indifference to the human cost of his actions, reinforcing the image of a man disconnected from the moral implications of his violence. This stoic, almost serene, presence in court made him all the more terrifying, as it shattered any illusion of a recognizable human emotional landscape. This emotional void contributed significantly to what made him so terrifying. Unlike many other serial killers who might kill for pleasure, for a twisted sense of power derived from the suffering of others, or for some financial gain, Greenwood's motives appeared far more abstract and ritualistic. His killings were not simply about the act of taking a life. They were imbued with a deeply ritualistic purpose, possibly tied to occult beliefs or a personal, warped spiritual agenda. The cups of blood, the candles, the symbolic arrangements. These elements suggested a motive beyond the purely sadistic. They hinted at a system of belief, however perverse, that justified his actions and gave them a meaning known only to him. This added layer of inexplicable motivation made him harder to categorize and, therefore, more profoundly frightening. Furthermore, his ability to blend in was a critical component of his terror. Vaughn Greenwood was not a figure who stood out. He was clean-cut, polite, and unremarkable in his daily interactions. He was the quintessential ghost, someone who moved through society largely unnoticed. This allowed him to operate with impunity for an extended period, stalking the streets of Skid Row without drawing suspicion from the public or, for a considerable time, from law enforcement. His mundane appearance served as the ultimate camouflage, allowing him to approach his victims, commit unspeakable acts, and then disappear back into the urban fabric, leaving behind only death and confusion. The contrast between his ordinary exterior and his monstrous deeds was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his identity, reminding everyone that evil does not always wear a discernible uniform. Ultimately, Greenwood's killings served as a grim and undeniable indictment of how little society, at the time, seemed to care about its most vulnerable members. The fact that a serial killer could operate for over a decade, preying almost exclusively on the homeless, was a stark testament to the systemic neglect and invisibility afforded to this population. Their lives, often overlooked in life, were also largely overlooked in death, allowing a killer to operate in plain sight without immediate and widespread alarm. The murders exposed a societal blind spot, revealing how long a predator could operate undetected when his victims were, in the eyes of many, already considered expendable or simply ignored. This grim societal critique embedded within the very nature of Greenwood's crimes made his case not just a story of a serial killer, but a commentary on the values or lack thereof within the urban landscape. His reign was a stark, brutal education for the city, forcing a painful realization about the cost of indifference. The conviction and incarceration of Vaughn Greenwood brought a formal close to the reign of the Skid Row slasher. Yet the unsettling echoes of his crimes reverberate through Los Angeles's history and continue to serve as a stark, enduring lesson. His narrative is not merely a chronicle of violence, but a profound and disturbing examination of how malevolence can fester in plain sight, preying on societal blind spots and challenging our fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil. The legacy of Vaughn Greenwood forces a continued introspection into the vulnerabilities of urban populations and the insidious ways in which indifference can inadvertently facilitate the darkest acts. One of the most persistent and unnerving aspects of Greenwood's legacy is the concept of the ghost killer. This was not a perpetrator who sought notoriety through public declarations or a distinct, visible presence. Instead, he was a master of evasion, a man who, despite his horrific actions, remained largely unidentifiable for years. His ability to blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, maintaining a clean-cut appearance and a polite demeanor, was central to his prolonged success. This allowed him to move through the very neighborhoods he terrorized without raising suspicion. He could walk past potential witnesses, interact briefly with others, and then retreat into anonymity, leaving behind only the gruesome evidence of his passage. This chilling capacity for normalcy in the face of profound depravity challenges the comforting notion that monsters always look like monsters. It underscores the unsettling reality that the most dangerous individuals can often be those who are unremarkable, those who meticulously cultivate an illusion of harmlessness, making them all the more terrifying because their threat is cloaked in the ordinary. The case served as a brutal awakening, demonstrating that the absence of overt signs of disturbance does not equate to the absence of danger. Furthermore, Greenwood's ritualistic patterns provide a haunting glimpse into the complex and often incomprehensible motivations behind serial murder. His actions transcended mere violence for violence's sake. The deliberate positioning of bodies, the presence of blood in cups, the placement of candles, and the symbolic arrangements indicated a deeper, personal meaning. These were not random acts but components of a twisted ceremony, potentially rooted in occult beliefs or a highly personalized, aberrant spiritual system. This element elevates his crimes beyond simple homicide into a realm of deeply disturbing psychological inquiry. Unlike killers driven by clear impulses like sexual gratification or financial gain, Greenwood's motives seem to operate on a different, more abstract plane, making him exceptionally difficult to profile and understand. This lack of a conventional why contributed significantly to the terror he instilled, as it suggested a mind operating under its own perverse logic, a logic impenetrable to standard psychological frameworks. The ritualistic signature became not just a clue for investigators, but a chilling window into a mind consumed by a dark, private mythology. The victims of Vaughn Greenwood are central to understanding the societal implications of his reign. His consistent targeting of homeless men laid bare a critical societal failing. These individuals, already marginalized and often living without the protective networks of family or community, were inherently vulnerable. Their deaths often went unnoticed for extended periods, or were simply dismissed as unfortunate consequences of life on the streets. This systemic invisibility provided Greenwood with the perfect hunting ground. He exploited the very fact that these lives were often undervalued, recognizing that their absence would not provoke the same immediate and widespread alarm as the disappearance of someone from a more affluent or visible segment of society. The prolonged period during which Greenwood operated without apprehension, a decade, punctuated by periods of intense activity, was a direct consequence of this societal oversight. His victims, ironically, became the unwitting catalysts for a painful societal reckoning, forcing a re-evaluation of how communities view and protect their most vulnerable members. The Skid Row slasher case became a tragic mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth that societal neglect can create fertile ground for predation. In the decades since his conviction, Vaughn Greenwood has remained incarcerated, a stark reminder of the long reach of justice. Yet, the questions surrounding his motivations, the specifics of his rituals, and the full extent of his hidden malice continue to intrigue and disturb. True crime enthusiasts, criminologists, and legal scholars revisit his case, dissecting the details, searching for deeper insights into the dark corners of the human psyche. His story is not just a historical account of a murderer. It is a case study in forensic science, criminal psychology, and the sociology of urban vulnerability. It underscores the tireless efforts of detectives who, despite immense challenges, pieced together the puzzle of his crimes, linking seemingly unrelated incidents across a decade to bring a dangerous individual to justice. The narrative of Vaughn Greenwood, the Skid Row slasher, ultimately concludes with a stark, undeniable warning. Monsters do not always conform to our preconceived notions. They do not always wear outward signs of their malevolence. Sometimes, the most terrifying evil resides within individuals who appear entirely ordinary, who move through our world unnoticed, their dark intentions hidden beneath a veneer of polite normalcy. Greenwood's decade-long reign of terror on Skid Row serves as a potent, unsettling reminder that while justice was eventually served, the capacity for profound evil can hide in the most unexpected places, often flourishing in the silence of societal neglect. His story stands as a chilling testament to the enduring presence of hidden darkness and the imperative for constant vigilance, even when the immediate threat seems to have receded.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more.